Well, hello there, Dr. Barry here. We are moving into another area of deviance. We started off the term defining, explaining, going over theory, kind of get into like a functionalist perspective of deviance a little bit, like why do we have deviance? Why do we ban behavior? Kind of reading over an application or a case study of wayward Puritans. Then what do we go to? We got like positivism, positivist theories of deviance, or oftentimes criminology, and then getting into constructionist ideas of deviance, discussion about moral panics. So that's kind of where we've been. Now we're kind of going to move into some different areas. We're going to move to the micro level this week, where we're getting into labeling theory and stigma. It gets a little bit, I would say, more complex, more difficult to kind of like put your finger on things. There's a lot going on, and thinking about labeling theory and thinking about stigma, it's just a little bit slippier. It's harder to identify the extent of influence and where those influences are. So it's a little bit wonky kind of getting into this area, just FYI. So we're going to talk about labeling theory this week, and then move on to medicalization of social control and social control, then labeling theory and social control, and then start kind of wrapping things up, looking at institution, looking at the criminal justice system, and then thinking about fear and stigma and control. So that is where we are headed. So labeling, right? So much to think about, and this will make sense as we go on throughout in this lecture, and also in reading in Henry's book. Man, there's just the writing about labeling theory and trying to put that in a nice organized fashion is a little bit challenging to do. And Henry is kind of weaving this story about all these different aspects of labeling theory. So you're going to go on a little bit of a journey, and it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy road or curvy road going through this examination of labeling theory. So a couple of things to kind of think through, just so as a preliminary exercise, something to consider. Is it possible not to label? Let's probably say there's going to be labeling. We categorize, right? So part of living in a social world, and a complex social world, is we categorize. We create shortcuts, heuristics. We stereotype. We assign meaning to the world. We're going to do that. So the question isn't sometimes like, is it, do we not, or do we label? It's more, what are we labeling? How are we labeling? Who's deciding what the labels are? And then what's the impact of labeling on others? So those are like some different questions that get us out of this, like, let's just stop labeling, or kind of perspective. There's a lot of problems and difficulties or limitations of labeling, right? So the problems of it may not be judicious in terms of who's being labeled. There could be a person's status, could be two people engaging in the same behavior, but one person's status is different than another, and they receive a different response from the community, whether that's illegal or informal. Sometimes another problem with labeling is the label may not fit. There may be a good reason for a particular behavior or action, but that other people are assigning meaning to it that may not fit the circumstance. So thinking about individuals who are unsheltered or individuals who are homeless, the assigning of meaning and the stigmatization without understanding that person's life history. So there's problems in, like, is there a good match between the label and the actual experience? Like, there could be a disjoint going on there. And there's, among other things, it probably could lay out a lot of different limitations, but among other things, that labels can make a difference to different degrees, right? So labeling has consequences. There may be some pro-social aspects to labeling, but there may be some very negative or counterproductive elements of labeling as well. So it's being aware of the power of labeling, and then being more judicious, more fair, more understanding in terms of the process of assigning labeling. To what degree do labels impact the individual? Well, it's hard to say. And that's like a great answer, isn't it? She's like, it's hard to say. It's hard to say because, there's a lot of different variables to consider. A person's overall status. So a person who has a lot of status, let's say economic status, political status, social status, labels are going to have a harder time, sticking. a person with a lot of status, they may engage in a behavior that's much more in violation of a community standard than someone who is, unsheltered, living in the streets. But it's that way, the power of that person living in the street is different than the person who has all these other status kind of things going on. So the labels, and some people, respond to labels in different ways. Some people get labeled in terms of being deviant. Somebody who, wearing not wearing shoes in a public restaurant or a public place. Some people, like the reaction from the community matters to them less than others. Doesn't mean they're stronger or have a stronger moral will or more independent. There just could be a lot of different factors that are going on. So it's complicated. And then maybe in class we'll do this, but think about a list of labels to apply to an individual who has a substance abuse dependency problem. And I think by studying labels, we can study culture, we can study our value system, our ideas, our belief system. And then it kind of gets us an understanding also about how we're approaching particular social issues and social problems. So thinking about a particular word, somebody's a junkie, for example, like that particular terminology versus someone with an addiction, different language system representing different values and ideas, and also shaping the way that we respond to these in terms of individually, as a community, and then more largely as a larger social system. So this just came out of, I was just looking up for something the other day as I was preparing for this, and then found this. It's like, okay, this would be a good one to include. This is from Revised Sociology. I've read different information from them before. I don't know a whole lot about that particular website, but this is, I think, just won't walk through all the aspects of it, but just to kind of get into the complexities of labeling theory kind of stuff. And they're focused here on crime. So one branch we're going to go down here is okay, we'll think about the labels of being socially constructed. Who's deciding how are labels created? What are all the processes involved in creating labels? How do labels reinforce or as a reflection of inequalities that are going on in society itself? So that's all kind of like labeling theory, kind of social construction stuff. And then kind of coming over here, not everyone who is deviant or engaged in criminal behavior gets labeled as such. Okay, what are all the different influences that shape whether or not a person gets labeled as being deviant? Sometimes it may be power. Sometimes it could be the ways in which people negotiate things. Could be like how we understand circumstances, or whether or not an individual has an opportunity to provide their circumstances. I mean, there's all these different kind of things. Then we get into labeling theory, like a positive kind of deviance kind of thing, or positive evaluations. Takes the side of the powerless, try to be more empathetic and more understanding, shifting language, challenging, kind of more stigmatizing language. So it's like, how do we kind of think about that? And then kind of like this basics, like the theoretical umbrella. Maybe this is like, I should have started here, the bigger theoretical umbrella. That labeling theory comes out of interactionism as a theoretical approach. So getting us into the process of making meaning and interactionist stuff, language, culture, and then the critiques. Not everybody who's labeled as deviant or as a criminal is impacted adversely by that label itself. Sometimes, that the label may not connect well with the offense, and it gives a justification for what a person did, why they did what they did. So the label becomes an excuse, so to speak, or a justification. I'm trying to think of like, particular crime, like, crime where, I just had, thinking about when the language of a super predator this is 1980s, 1990s, like that language that was being used by politicians and others, kind of like that. It's a powerful label because it provides this assumption that people couldn't do anything else. Like that's who they're designed to kind of be. So that's another criticism. It's like, okay, it's a little bit, sometimes doesn't fit in that way. The labeling theory doesn't get into primary deviance, which is deviance before being labeled. So there's some like limitations with that. I can't share these videos with you in in this lecture because there'll be copyright issues with YouTube. But if you want, you can check them out. Maybe we'll watch one or both of them in class. But looking at the issues of obesity is an interesting one. The power of stigma, the labeling of individuals in terms of who don't fit a particular body size and shape, very cultural, very historical, gendered aspects of that as well, and the impact of that stigmatization and concerns about stigmatization by others. I mean, it's real, right? I mean, it's real kind of stuff. Thought it was interesting, this book called Lost Connections, as I've mentioned a couple times before. One of the part of the book is this conversation about the origins of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and not a survey instrument, an instrument to measure the impact of adverse life experiences or childhood experiences, traumas on a person's life. Somebody comes to a social service agency, an individual, and provide them with an ACE questionnaire. Based on that questionnaire and responses, how many traumas does a person experienced in their childhood, and to understand that and understand how those childhood traumas shape and influence a person's current behavior and ways of thinking and knowing. And in Lost Connections, he kind of gives the background. Johan Hari gives background to the person who came up with this questionnaire, designed the questionnaire. And it's really interesting, this examination of individuals who were obese, and individuals who are obese, and trying to understand, okay, what's the cause, what's the influence of obesity. They originally had this sort of very limited understanding about obesity, of this sort of cultural view about it's about moral strength, or individuals who have motivation, discipline, and these kind of different kind of things, they realized eventually that they were missing a big part of understanding obesity. And one part, not the whole story, so got to be mindful of this as well. So part of the story is that for a significant portion of the population that's obese, that adverse childhood experiences are related to that. So it's trauma that a person experiences, and different kinds of trauma in a person's early life experiences impacts them physiologically in their sense of self. And I think, if we understand that and understand a person's or a group's life histories, that it becomes helps us to become more understanding, more empathic, and more aware of some of the powers of these labels on individuals. Okay, so that's a little bit of background information and context. You think I'm promoting this book like a big time. I've talked about it a few different times. I think it's just a really interesting and really easily digestible and easy to get into book, that Lost Connections. All right, let's talk about now, let's kind of move into the themes, becoming a deviant. So here the focus is on the process of becoming a deviant. So I could tie back and go back to things such as Sutherland's differential association theory, right? So that all behaviors learn behavior. We learn it in a context. We learn it being around others. We learn techniques and rationalizations and justifications and motives for engaging in particular behavior. The more time we spend with that group, the more intensely we're involved in that group, and the more priority we give that group, the more that group has an influence over our ways of thinking, knowing, and doing. So that's about a process, right? That's a process of like an individual goes through to become a deviant. There's also this idea that being deviant or becoming a deviant is a process, in the sense, not only like social learning theory from Sutherland, but also this navigation of the label itself, being identified in terms of stigmatization of being labeled as being deviant. How does a person manage their identity around this spoiled part of their identity or the stigmatized part of their identity? It's important to remember too that, we go from the attitude, the ABCs, right? The attitude, the behavior, or the condition. We go from that objective, measurable thing to identity and an influence on one's sense of self-concept, who they are, their identity, their experience. So that's kind of a process, right? Of kind of getting there. We could get into like Lemert's societal reaction perspective, which I find this particular theory idea fascinating. And that's where Lemert is separating out what he calls, the primary deviance, where it's mostly before being identified as being deviant. So there's no label, or if there is, it's such a mild, temporary kind of thing. There's no identity being built around being deviant. There's no commitment to it in terms of a deviant identity itself. There may be a commitment to a behavior or a way of thinking and knowing, but not a commitment to deviance per se, in terms of, because the label's not there yet. It's much more easy to neutralize, keep the stigma at bay before a person is identified as being deviant or criminal. It could change based on situation. It could be like a person's behavior, situational, it's sporadic, changes across time and place. And it's still easy in that primary deviance stage to differentiate between self and deviant others, like to stay out of that circle. Moving to secondary deviance, where, okay, now it's the labels happened. There's been some stigmatization. There's been exclusion from different social groups based on that labeling of an individual as being deviant. So now all of a sudden, there becomes this process of becoming deviant. And hopefully this idea will kind of start to make a little bit more sense. So a person is identified as being deviant. Now there's a stigma that is shaping and influencing their identity, or at least they have to manage and wrestle with the stigma now. So now deviance becomes a sort of process that enters a stage of reconciling, like a little bit of cognitive dissonance stuff going on, where audience members, people in the community, individuals are identifying someone as being deviant. Now the individual has to figure out how to negotiate that. It becomes part of their identity in a much more, in a more significant way. Secondary deviance addresses what's the response to that stigmatization or to that label. So it's possible, for example, that stigma actually may magnify the deviant or criminal behavior itself, and not because of any of the original reasons why the person engaged with a particular deviant or criminal behavior, but now it's because of exclusion. Now it's because of animosity towards the group that's doing the labeling. Now it's for these other reasons. So it's the label itself that is shaping future behavior. So this is the power. This is like all 1960s, go in the background in terms of theoretically, University of Chicago, symbolic interactionism. There's a field that, is developing these ideas of examining that symbolic world, the world of language, the world of that subgroup, and starting to identify and examine the influence of language, the influence of stigma on one's identity. And then it gets to like the tertiary deviance. This is after Lemert. Lemert did primary, secondary, and researchers have added tertiary now, where tertiary it's like almost like a move of self-preservation. Where in secondary, it's this like, the response to the label. Third, it's like embracing the label itself or bringing it into one's own identity and owning it, almost like developing a sense of self-esteem around it. So taking something that's negative and turning it into a positive. It makes me think about, for example, the queer movement in the 1970s. So 1960s gay rights movement. There was language going on at the time period in mass culture. Queer was a really negative, stigmatizing language. Individuals started to embrace that terminology, like we are queer, and move that language and that conversation from a criticism, a negative, to something different. So it's taking ownership and maybe in some ways challenging it and moving it in a different direction. So here's, here's primary deviance, secondary deviance. You can read it over. I mean, it's basically what I said, but just kind of give you a visual kind of layout of that. The classical labeling process, that it's like, okay, there's the behavior or the thing itself. There's the sanction. It could be a way of degrading the body, a degradation ceremony, oftentimes going into prison. There's a lot of degradation, removal of one's name, one's identity. There's a ceremony of formal sanction, stigma, and that influences one's sense of self. through either like this Cooley looking glass self, which I think we talked about before, or just sort of the ways in which we develop a sense of self. And that may shape this sort of secondary deviance. And then there's the third, that tertiary level. So that's kind of, a model to kind of bring forward. So we can kind of add to this a little bit and say, okay, well, deviance can be a master status. This is like deviance is a process. It becomes more and more part of our identities. That this is why I'm differentiating between the learning theories like differential association or even Hershey's social control theory. And now getting into this process of becoming a deviant, where it becomes a master status, where it becomes an important part of one's identity and how other people see that particular individual. Kind of remember or recall back this sort of idea about an interaction between the actor and the audience. This is like Goffman and dramaturgy, that there's the actor, the individual who's being stigmatized, and there's the audience that's doing the stigmatization. And that there's an interaction going on between the two. And there's the audience in this case can have a lot of influence on how it engages with, or it has total influence on how it engages with the actor, what language it uses to engage with the actor. And that master status could be the way that the audience starts to see the actor, that through this lens of the master status. Like a person can have a complex identity set, complex life experiences, but one element of their life experience gets kind of isolated, the spotlight is shined on it, and we forget about the complexity of that person's life. It's like this one thing. And then you can think about the power of that, right? So, somebody who working in a particular institution who's gone through alcohol and drug treatment, where now all of a sudden they may be viewed through a lens in terms of an individual who is struggling with addiction. And it's hard for them to leave that part of their identity outside of, they can't just put that identity away because other people are seeing them through that identity. And so it can have a real impact on all these ideas like looking glass self, the response from the audience, and these different kind of things. I think one great example is Brian Stevenson, great example of thinking about this issue of master status, or provide an example. Brian Stevenson, my first introduction to him and his work was through a TED Talk titled, "We Need to Talk About Injustice." And he's devoted his life, his career to, and I should say life, not a career. I think it's not for him, it's a passion, a life calling to address inequities in the criminal justice system, and inequities specifically within capital punishment. And he comes from a place of utmost compassion and respect and common humanity, promoting common humanity. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, which was turned into a feature film with Michael B. Jordan. Read the book. The movie, it's a good movie, but the book really provides a lot of interesting case study situations and getting into his motivations for becoming involved in this work. And he talks about oftentimes in his when he's given a lecture or he's being interviewed, he talks about this idea that we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And he says, if you stole something, you're more than a thief. If you took someone's life, you killed someone, you're more than a murderer. If you embezzled money, you're more than an embezzler. If you were a slaveholder, you're more than an enslaver. That it's all these different kind of things. And to me, it's like, wow, it's really, I think, a powerful way to look at this sort of looking glass, or this master status, is that the master status says, you stole, you are a thief, master status. And here's, Brian Stevens says, okay, we are more than that. And to be mindful that we are more than that one thing that we did, or a person did. Okay, so let's kind of move on to theme number 2. Let's kind of talk about Cooley a little bit, and Mead, the looking glass self for Cooley, and Mead, just sort of a view of human development. So Cooley, if you've taken a social class before or social psych, you kind of get that idea of Cooley. Cooley has this idea of the looking glass self, that we form a sense of self based on how we imagine others see us. So it's our perception, like, okay, I'm imagining how other people think of me, see me, view me. I'm interpreting that, and I'm responding to that. This is how we form a sense of self. And it's first, for Cooley, society and self are twin born, that you cannot develop a sense of self without developing a sense of without being immersed and involved in society itself. So, okay, society and self are twin-born. That's sort of the idea here for Cooley. So you form a sense of self based on that, imagining how other people see you. So you can already start to get into this place of stigma, right? So imagining how other people may see me based on this part of my identity or part of my experience. So it's imagine how we appear to others, imagine that judgment from others. It's a process that is going on that individuals go through. It's about how we both form our understanding of how others see us. And sometimes can be very inaccurate in terms of our perceptions of how others see us. And it's also about how we respond to them, to those judgments. So that's kind of Cooley in a nutshell. And then you get into Mead. Mead gets into this idea of like taking the role of other. This is how we learn. We learn to take the role of the other. And as we grow and develop, we develop more sophisticated others that we take the role of. So when we're young, we take the role of a specific other, mother, father, friend, teacher, and we understand, okay, mom, dad thinks this, my caregiver thinks this. I'm imagining how they may view me based on what I do here. So that's taking the role of the specific other. Then you get to the generalized other, it's more about society itself. So it's no longer about the specific other. So an individual who is unsheltered, has this idea of generalized other, the expectations from society itself, and is imagining that's where the stigma starts to become pretty powerful. There's the I, and then there's the me. So there's an interaction going on between the two. The me is the social engaged part, the reaction from responses to others, and the I is more the autonomous or the self that is away from that social, more removed from that social interaction. So sometimes the me, all that stuff going on in society and social judgment happening can be very overwhelming to a sense of I, to a sense of my own or an individual's own identity. Henry talks about, taking the role of other. It follows that behavior is controlled by social groups. Self-control is social control. So we make decisions to adjust, conform, and resist to the position of others. So it's a pretty powerful kind of quote, I think. This idea that self-control, that we're self-regulating, but it's also an instrument of social control, right? It's the ways in which groups and others are shaping, influencing us. The identity transformation in which a person comes to believe that they are or have a deviant identity rather than a person who deviates. So now the shift is to this deviant identity. It's not a two-step process, but it moves and changes across time. This is why I said it's wonky a little bit, right? There's no model that can say this is how fast it goes. This is the degree of intensity of becoming a deviant or that deviant identity forming. That process is being shaped by a lot of different factors. You're probably wondering what this is. Maybe I'll come back in class. I'll mention sort of what that's the story behind that, what that's all about. Okay, so influences on navigation, the looking glass self. So perceptions of how others view the self. There can be different degrees of accuracy in those sense of perceptions, right? So Homer Simpson, way off in terms of his perceptions, right? Of how he sees himself, of what he even sees, what he thinks that society expects of him may be way off, right? So this becomes one of the distortions of the looking glass self, is that people's perceptions may be off. And even if they're accurate, it doesn't address the meaning of that label to different people. And the degree to which that stigmatization is present, or whether or not the stigma is a temporary thing or a more chronic thing, and the repercussions or consequences. And even if we say it's accurate, it still doesn't address the issue of the status of the individual on the meanings of the label and consequences. So just example here, right? So even if the understanding is accurate for a person, it doesn't get us to understanding the power of the status of the individual to shape how that's being navigated in terms of that stigma. Then we can kind of get into Mead and that idea of the generalized other, the expectations of society. The idea of this I and the me are interactive, right? There's the idea of the social self being involved in the social world, getting ideas about maybe being labeled, being stigmatized, then being reflecting on that, thinking about that, incorporated in the sense of the I, and then just this constant circulation going on between the two, like forming a stable sense of self and self-identity. And the stigma becomes something that intervenes in that process, right? So it's like, okay, now we have this understanding of like societal expectations. Maybe it's like social groups that a person belongs to, so more specific others. And these all are part of what's being navigated in terms of a person's identity. So you can kind of go down this pathway, think about language and crime, think about who committed a crime, including the labels, like an arsonist, type out just maybe when they're in class, we'll do this as an exercise, write out the words, and then ask the questions of, well, how are those labels applied? Why are they applied? The extent to what degree are they powerful? How do we sort of think through some of those complexities of that? Okay, let's go. This is still theme 2, but another issue that Henry talks about, this idea of discrediting, or something that's discreditable. So it's not publicly known. It could be like secret deviants, people who are passing, right? So they're engaged in some deviant attitude, behavior, or condition, but they're passing. They're managing information, right? They're managing what they share and what they don't share. A lot of dramaturgy going on here. So it's like impression management. They know, an individual may know it goes against the standard of the group, or they know that group's going to frown upon it. So they pass within that particular environment. So they're preventing being discredited. Henry provides the example of adolescent boys, of ways of engaging in dramaturgical kind of stuff to prevent this idea of being discredited. There's a lot of different strategies for deflecting the possibility of being labeled. And it's idea of like giving a performance to remove the possibility of being labeled as being deviant. But then you kind of get into some issues, right? So a person passes, that they hide part of their identity from the social group. And there may be really important, valuable reasons for doing that, like putting aside one's part of one's identity as they enter an institution or a social group. And they realize that they need to do that to survive in that particular context, or that the stigma could be problematic, that for a lot of different reasons, right? That master status component or other components. So a person passes within an environment, but then they may feel as if they are not being their true self, that they're hiding themselves, they're inauthentic, that they're a fraud. So this becomes another layer of complexity that a person has to deal with then. So that they manage it, a person may manage, they may pass. There may be very, very strategic reasons for doing so. But then it's like dealing and wrestling with this issue of inauthenticity that a person has to wrestle with. People are focusing on managing the stigma, right? A spoiled identity, maintaining a positive self-image, to disavow the deviant label itself, which is like to acknowledge the deviant status, but affirm a more positive kind of image around things. So to take something, to turn it from a negative stigma, to own it, recognize it, turn it into a more positive, affirming thing. And I think in some ways, like that strategy, these strategies may not be available to everyone, may be influenced by their own status position. And then, you can like read through all these, but these different issues that come up about ways of strategizing to dealing with labeling. You could avoid others, try to delegitimize the effects of the stigma, or the delegitimize the origin of the stigma, whoever's giving that a stigma. Challenge that idea of deviance, so kind of push up against it. And these are all strategies or different responses to it. And this is Brian Stevenson, maybe, I mentioned him earlier. This is what I was trying to get after about that master status kind of component. Henry says the strength of our own individual sense of self relative to our sense of social selves that we internalize because of role playing, the generalized others view held of us by others, can have a significant impact on whether we become deviant. So our sense of self, right? Relative to our sense of our social self, like who do I think I am versus who I am kind of thing. And what we internalize in terms of this idea of the generalized other can have a profound influence in terms of our own identity, our own experience. So, okay, next theory or perspective is this idea of dramaturgy. I've mentioned it kind of before, so let's kind of talk about it a little bit more detail. So Goffman has this idea of dramaturgy, that the world is a stage. We are players, merely players. It's a Shakespearean idea. You have the actor. The actor is putting on a performance. Actor has a costume. Actor is in a setting. Actor has a script. So it's all these dramaturgy, like we are playing out particular roles. There's an interaction between the actor and the audience, that the audience is looking for a certain performance, and whether or not the actor gives that performance, and there's an interplay going between the audience and the performance. Stigma implies that there's a spoiled part of the performer. And sometimes there's a dramaturgical part of performing the role of that spoiled identity. Like, how should that be presented to the community itself, right? So there's this impression management that goes on both before labeling and then also after labeling, this sense of, okay, how do you present a sense of self in this particular environment? So dramaturgical elements help us to understand how people reconcile their own history with this spoiled identity, this master status component in terms of who they are. Desire to hide a deviant past or present. There's consequences, that sort of inner struggle kind of component. And one strategy may be to embrace that identity as a positive kind of strategy. So dramaturgy is really interesting to look at, right? So Goffman would say it's all about impression management. We all do this in circumstances. I mean, it's part of what we do. We're pro-social. Humans are pro-social. We desire to belong to members of groups. And one way we do that is through trying to manage impressions with others. So if there's a spoiled part of one's identity, something that's being identified as being bad, as being a problem, it's like, okay, well, how does a person navigate that? One way to think about how a person navigates that is through this lens of thinking about dramaturgy, presentation of self in an environment. So I put this image here to say, we don't know like really what's going, who these individuals are outside of, let's say, this workspace, right? But they're presenting this image in terms of who they are. They may engage and may drink a lot, have alcohol-related problems, but they're managing. They understand the power of stigma labeling, and so they're managing an identity. And then we look at the individual who's on the street, right? Living on the street and asking for money. There's this sort of dramaturgical element, I would say, even in that of managing impression, keeping one's identity solid in a way. I mean, we like to feel good about who we are. So it's like, how do we manage these spoiled parts of our identity becomes the issue. And then the last theme is this sort of relationship between macro, micro, audience, actor, and stigma. So one thing we have to kind of think about label when we think about the stigma. We got to deal with the macro level, culture, societal, historical kind of stuff, like social construction of reality, issues of power relations between different groups, what's shaping, what's being defined as being deviant. The sort of mid-level stuff, things like even moral entrepreneurs, to bring that term forward, who's shaping what's being defined as being deviant, and the labels that are being used in terms of deviant, organizations that are shaping things, community members or the community itself, community organizations, all the way down to the micro level, the people that we know, our personal encounters, like all that kind of stuff. So different levels, that interaction between the individual, I should put here, it's the stigma, the label, and then the individual. Like there's that relationship too, right? And we could try to untangle or look at things like functionalism, right? Say, okay, well, part of stigma and part of is a reflection of the will of the community. It's a way of reinforcing boundaries between what's right and wrong. It's a way of affirming our collective values, and it's bringing solidarity or distinction between those who are inside and outside of that group. Okay, that's like one way of thinking about stigma and labeling. What functions does it serve? There's also that conflict theory side of things, right? Of looking at that labeling sometimes reflects and reinforces inequalities in society itself. Then we get into the interactionist perspective, thinking about all these issues of identity, thinking about the meaning of the language itself. I mean, that gets us into the world of the interactionist perspective. We can think about the relationship between all three of these, think about, status as being, achieve what we've done to get a status, ascribed status, what we're given involuntarily or at birth, embodied status, the characteristics are attributes, to be tall, to be short, to body appearance, like these are all embodied, in the master status. And so this is like achieved status, like the actor is mostly responsible for their actions. Like, this is what I did to get here. And in a certain way, the audience may respond differently in that case than something that may be more ascribed or more embodied. So the types of status that become important here, and thinking about how does the type of status influence the degree or type of stigma that's going on. To become a secondary deviant, the actor must accept the deviant label that the audience seeks to confer, and the audience needs to further respond to the person whose moral standing is in question. So this is that relationship between the actor and the audience now, right? So the actor, ABC on something, attitude, behavior, condition, audience responds, boom. Now it's like, now it's the response back from the actor. So we're getting into this kind of interaction between the audience and the actor itself around this issue of stigma. And then you kind of look at, well, different audiences have different reactions, right? So it's not like the labels applied equally the same in all social groups. The groups it may depend on the social group. Maybe think about the saying within 12-step group programs, change playmates, change playgrounds. And the reason I brought this up here is sort of this idea of changing playmates, changing playgrounds, that we can't expect to do the same thing by staying around the same people and doing the same stuff all the time. So if someone wants to move away from their addiction, it's important for them to change who they associate with, and sometimes change the playgrounds, people, or the places that they go to. Part of that is to the reason this comes up in terms of stigma. There could be a pro-social aspect to the stigma, right? So one self-preservation move may be to go to another group and to stay in a group that is sheltering one from that stigma in a counterproductive way. If you see what I'm saying, like to be involved in a group that agrees and supports a particular behavior that may be harmful to oneself or other. So sometimes it's like it's having the ability to step into the stigma and navigate that, and that, just to be more empathetic, that is a hard, difficult thing to do. Stereotypes are going to be part of this, right? So if we're talking about labels, we're going to talk about stereotyping. And when we start to get to that, we're going to start to move to the audience and the context and culture, and remove from our discussion just the actor. And I think that's an important shift. So it forces us to examine, audience level stuff, context setting, as well as culture and society. And I think sometimes if we don't become reflexive or think more consciously about this labeling, it limits our ability to see the humanity in others. I mean, I think we learn stuff, in our culture that sometimes is very counterproductive, and things happen, then we start to lose our ability to have empathy with others. So it's like trying to generate empathy and understanding for the experience of others. Those who view others, through this lens of a stereotype, oftentimes view it as objective, like they see it as accurate, and the recipient does not. And that kind of probably makes sense, right? Where the person who's applying that stereotype may not see the flaws and limitations of the stereotype itself. The degree of impact on the label and the stereotype. What are the consequences for that? Those are the things that we kind of consider. And then Henry brings up, a couple different things. Looking at stereotypes, stigma, discrimination, not isolated phenomena, but are social processes to maintain social control, reproduce social inequality, stigma that is produced and used to help order society. Most societies achieve conformity by contrasting the normal from the deviant. Cultures therefore produce difference in order to achieve social control, very functionalist in sort of thinking. And maybe we'll talk about these terms when we kind of come back into class. I thought that was the last one, but there's actually this last one on changing the language. So there's this resistance or the ability in certain time periods, I think it happens more often, where there's this move to change the language or to change that stigma. And we can think about some of the factors that might influence the changing of the label. It's like, well, who's sitting at the table and making decisions about the label? Could be cultural values are shifting and moving and thinking about things. Could be the way that we understand, the human experience and different groups' experiences. I mean, it could be all those different kind of things. So the role of power here, the power to have control over shaping the labeling is really important to kind of examine. Thinking about this example of transgender individuals who are transgender, the struggles that they may face in terms of within social settings and environments, the impact on their mental health. This would be a secondary deviance kind of level, kind of a response and reaction. And it's important that we examine the changing of language and understand the origins of language. Using the language more common today to say unhoused or unsheltered. When I first heard that language, it's like, okay, what's this about? Moving this direction of unhoused, unsheltered. What's this terminology? Where's it coming from? And you start to kind of like, the more I explored, it's like, oh, I get the connection to stigma, right? So the idea is that the person is building a shelter by a roadway and they actually live in that space, let's say for 6 months, and they've built this place. For them, that is their home. So that individual is not homeless. To be identified as homeless is kind of strip part of their identity and their dignity away from them. And so moving to things like unsheltered or unhoused, or I think unsheltered is probably a more neutral term, is a step of decreasing the stigma. But there's one thing I think that has to be included, that it's the public has to be aware of why that shift in language. If the public just either resists using that new language, doesn't see there's value in it, or is shifting to the language, but it's not shifting their stigma, I think it's problematic. I think it's a move maybe in the right direction. The intention may be a solid, positive intention, but I think there has to be that component of like why the change, so we can get to understand, stigma and that particular part. So we're talking about labeling, right? I told you it's wonky. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's different things that we'll explore in class. Henry talks about theory of office, which is real interesting. There's the Rosenhan study we'll talk about in class. So anyway, there's different things. I'm not going to go through that component, but we'll kind of leave there just sort of a lot of, you can scroll through those PowerPoints if you want. Yeah, so bring questions forward. It's always about a conversation in class as well. This is I think, potentially a more confusing, more enriching, more dynamic, very interesting area of looking at deviance, but it's hard sometimes to put sort of neat boxes around it. All right, be safe, be well, have a good day.